What are China's global ambitions, and what is its vision for its place in the world?
I think it's important to recognize that if you go back to 2014, Xi Jinping, who's the General Secretary of the Communist Party and the President of China, said that China should lead in the reform of the global governance system. It should not only contribute to write the rules of the game, but to create the playgrounds on which the games are played. And so I think just to start off, let's understand that he has a mission to change the international system in ways that align with Chinese interests, Chinese values, Chinese priorities. And, it's not surprising. China is the second largest economy. It has the largest military in the world, now has the second largest population after India, but it's a big power. And why wouldn't it want the international system to reflect its own values and priorities? In terms of what that international system looks like, in some respects, it begins with China wanting, and Xi Jinping, I should say, wanting to just redraw the map of China to reclaim all of the territory that China considers to be its sovereign territory. So, that not only includes, Taiwan, but also the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands that are administered by Japan. We have a border conflict with India. All told, China has 14 different territorial conflicts. So, I think it begins with a sense going back through history to imperial times where China was considered kind of the middle kingdom, the center of the international system. So it starts with that China has redrawn the map of China to include all the territory that China considers to be its sovereign territory, China being whole again. I think second is pushing the United States out as the dominant player in the Indo-Pacific, and China being the dominant player in the Indo-Pacific militarily, right? China's already a really important player. It is the most important player in terms of trade. The US is still more important in terms of investment, but I think China is now recognized as the great power in the region. And I guess I should say it has military bases, which again is a fundamental shift from what came before, right? And the idea that China wants to have bases to protect its people who are abroad. It wants to have bases to protect its economic interests. But is that really all it is? Is there a point at which China then becomes actually a much more engaged military power operating globally as opposed to just in the Indo-Pacific? But what is clear is that China doesn't want to have a formal US-led alliance system in Asia or for NATO. It calls the alliance system anachronistic, a relic of the Cold War, targeted against China. So I think that's a different notion as well. When it comes to the infrastructure of the 21st century, particularly digital infrastructure, I think China would like to see that digital infrastructure globally is put in place by Chinese companies, in the same way that global infrastructure, was basically provided through European or American, or in some cases, Japanese, assistance. That's the 20th century. Now we're in the 21st century. And, China's fond of saying this is the Asian century, China century. So I think that would be another change in the way the world looks. And with that, again, with that technological infrastructure, with the subsea cables and the 5G and cloud and satellite systems, also comes, or would be desired by China's political values. Internet information flows are determined by the state. It wants states to have the capacity to shut what they call a shut up switch, right? So that any device that's connected to the internet at any point in time can be shut off from the state, by the state. That again is quite different from what the current sort of norms around internet governance are. Xi Jinping also has an idea that he wants to insulate the Chinese economy from the pressures of the global economy. That's what his whole dual circulation is about. So he says China can largely innovate, manufacture, and consume within itself. It wants to export, obviously. It also wants multinationals to be dependent on the Chinese economy for parts of their supply chain, but it does not want to have a dependence on the international economy. And I think that would be quite different from what you see today. So I think there are a range of norms and values that China would like to promote. One that we've seen more recently is a push for de-dollarization. It's not just the internationalization of the renminbi, of China's currency, but China would like to see the dollar play a much diminished role as a kind of global reserve currency. So I think across a wide array of issues, you see that China is putting forth a different set of values, a different set of norms that, again, reflect its own interests.
How do other countries view China's global ambitions?
There is a sense, and I would say it's true in both the United States and China, that we're competing for countries somehow. And the truth of it is, countries are independent agents. And they recognize their own interests, their own values. And there are important divisions between, let's say the United States and China on some issues. They may align with the United States on some and some China. Take a look at Vietnam, right? Vietnam, may in fact align with China on human rights issues or on, a sort of a broader sense of internet governance. But it certainly aligns with the United States in security. The United States is essential to Vietnam's security in the Indo-Pacific. So there are African countries who support China, because they see themselves in China. They're largely one party, one dictator states. And so China's way of doing business, China's interests around human rights, all those things resonate with these countries. And I think that's partly why you see China, China set up a training center in Tanzania for, the China model. How do you strengthen a one-party state? How do you do poverty alleviation? These are things that China has experience in, and that some, but not all African countries, will be interested in learning from China's experience. There are going to be countries like Japan and Australia and most of the countries of Europe that are 90% of the time going to be basically in line with the United States, because we do share similar political systems. We are allies, right? Military allies. We're basically all advanced economies. So you'll see that our interests are quite aligned. We tend to vote the same way on many important issues in the United Nations. And sometimes it'll be different from the way that China votes. But China has its own supporters. When the United States and Europe and others bring resolutions against China for abuses in Xinjiang, for human rights abuses in Xinjiang, we bring 30 countries, 40 countries, 45 countries along with us. China brings 40, 45, 50 countries along with it. But some of those countries, again, will not support China on other issues. So it's all by way of saying that, with some exceptions, like formal allies, that you're going to find a marriage here and a marriage there. And countries, again, are going to do what they believe, the leaders believe, is in their best interest.
How can China's growing international influence and power help benefit the world?
China can certainly play a constructive role in the international community, is now the second largest contributor to the United Nations in terms of its funds, and is the largest supporter of peacekeeping troops among the P5. There are definitely ways in which China can be a constructive actor. I wish that China would step up itself initially and more aggressively to be a constructive actor. So, for example, when it comes to climate change, China has agreed with the United States, for example, to limit methane. But that took a lot of pressure from the United States, and the United States rallying a lot of other countries to bring pressure to bear on China. I think there's a lot of room, whether we're talking about global public health, for example, with what we saw with COVID, with the pandemic, what we seen with climate change, for China to actually take the initiative. There's still an element within China today, I would argue, that is a little bit more about wanting the rights of being the great power without taking on all of the responsibilities. And, is there something, in China's notion of collective security as opposed to alliances? Look, it's clear that the US-led alliance system has not been enough to prevent Russia's invasion of Ukraine, to prevent what's going on, between Israel and the Palestinians, to take care of what's happening in Myanmar right now. So it's not enough. But what is China's idea of collective security? What has that actually contributed to resolve any of these crises either? I guess the question is, there are opportunities out there. I'd like to see China seize them and demonstrate what a China vision, what that looks like when it actually comes to pass, what positive things it brings. Again, you look at something like the Belt and Road Initiative, which in many respects is a great initiative, right? So as it's laid out, designed also to, fill a need for global infrastructure, but then how it was pursued was not so great. Right? Lots of labor issues, environmental externalities, a lack of transparency. Some countries assume too much debt, in terms of the projects and the return on investment. It does not look good. China can learn, though. China can adjust. China can improve. I'm willing to give it some space, right, to see what it can do. But I do think that it's gotten a little bit ahead of itself in terms of setting itself out as a global leader without actually demonstrating how it leads.
How is the United States responding to China's global ambitions?
The United States has gone through two phases, U.S. policy. I think the first, during the Trump administration, was really just a recognition that China was presenting some new and different and fairly significant kinds of challenges to U.S. interests and began to push back. But I think the administration pushed back in a way that didn't actually provide any alternatives to what China was doing. The Trump administration said, this is debt trap diplomacy, the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, I don't think actually that China initiated the Belt and Road in order to get countries into debt and make them then have to be dependent on China. I don't believe that at all. But that's what they said. They said, don't use Huawei 5G in your networks. We want clean networks. But we don't actually have an alternative, right? There's Nokia, there's Ericsson. But are we really going to pay for all countries to rip out Huawei 5G and put those other technologies in? No, we're not going to do that. I think what's changed is that the Biden administration has actually tried, in conjunction with the Europeans, the Japanese, again, pointing out that this is a bigger issue than just a US-China issue. I think they've tried to respond to a number of challenges. So, with the Belt and Road Initiative, there is now the Global Gateway from the Europeans and the PGII, Partnership for Global Infrastructure Initiative from the US, looking at Chinese economic coercion within the G7. The Japanese have led an initiative, and the US as well, to figure out how to help countries that come under pressure, economic pressure from China, to try to get at political results. So pressuring countries like Lithuania because of their support for Taiwan, or whatever it might be, going after Australia because they called for an investigation into COVID. So how can this group of countries support countries that feel that kind of economic pressure from China? Certainly, we've become much more active in the United Nations. I mean, the Trump administration, again, complained about China, but it's hard to complain when you're pulling out of the World Health Organization, the Paris Climate Accord, the JCPOA. I mean, we were just, the Human Rights Commission. I mean, we're pulling out of all of these things. It's really difficult to make a case that we are the pillar of the current international system. The Biden administration obviously has a different perspective. And I think we saw, for example, in the International Telecommunications Union, which, China had held the leadership position for 2 terms, an American got the leadership position there, first time in 70 years. So I think there's a much bigger effort underway from the United States and other countries to try to ensure that, when China tries to insert Chinese language, into UN resolutions or Chinese interests into the resolutions, that there's a pushback and a call out that this is not going to happen. So I think the U.S. And other countries they've awakened to sort of the full range of challenges that China is presenting. And in some cases have been very proactive. And in others, I think, for example, on the issue of de-dollarization, have not really done much because, there's a kind of argument out there that China's not going to make much progress in this area because it doesn't have open capital markets. And so unless it has, both free floating currency and allows, capital to flow freely among countries, it's never going to be a dominant reserve currency. But I think that misses the point because China erodes, around the edges, over time. And just like in the South China Sea, You're going to wake up one day, you're going to blink, and you're going to see a transformed landscape, with 7 artificial features sitting there. It's time for the U.S. to wake up on that one. But my point only being that the United States has developed a pretty robust response to many of the challenges that China presents.